A new opinion poll suggests that Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labor government is trailing the opposition coalition despite a pre-election campaign blitz. Albanese is yet to set the date for a national vote, but it must be held by mid-May. Our Australia government reporter Ben Westcott joins us now for Canberra, and we've seen a frenzy of to and fro and barbs being traded between the opposition and the government over the past few weeks, right? And are we starting to see some progress being made by the opposition?
Look, it has previously been a universal truth that there's no campaigning allowed before Australia Day, giving everyone a well-deserved break from politics, but that hasn't been respected this year. Both Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Opposition Leader Peter Dutton have been out and about, and so far it seems like there hasn't been much benefit for the Labor government. Every poll out, and we've had all the major ones so far, News Poll, Essential, Resolve and Freshwater, all show a lead to the centre-right coalition. But at this stage, it isn't so big a lead that A, it couldn't be overcome by the Labor government over the course of a campaign, or B, it wouldn't necessarily mean a win for the coalition. At this stage, some of the polling would indicate that it would be a Labor minority government governing alongside independent lawmakers and minor parties. But these are still very early stages. A lot of Australians still aren't turned on to the idea that there is an election about to happen. And although Peter Dutton's got a lot to be happy about, the game isn't over yet for anyone.
How are the economic challenges in the country right now complicating politics?
Oh, I mean, right now, Australians are suffering with a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, and to try and contain that inflation challenge, the Reserve Bank has kept interest rates at a 13-year high for at least a year now. Now, what we're going to really be seeing over coming weeks is whether or not inflation has weakened enough. In fact, we'll be seeing that tomorrow with the new inflation data to allow the Reserve Bank to lower interest rates. It's going to be all eyes on that inflation data tomorrow, more or less. And the government is now expected to potentially push its election past April in the hopes of getting at least one interest rate cut at either the February or the April RBA meetings. But given the somewhat confusing data, the very strong labour market, there's no indication of which direction the Reserve Bank might fall at either of those meetings.
Australia Government reporter Ben Westcott there with a state of play as we await for a date to be set. But our guest today is an independent MP who, along with her other fellow non-aligned lawmakers, may have a decisive role in determining the balance of power in Australia's next parliament. Allegra Spender is a federal member for Wentworth in Sydney's East and joins us now in the studio. Allegra, really great to have you with us. We appreciate your time, as of course it's a busy parliamentary season. At this point in time, as we await, a formal date being set, what would you be looking at in terms of policy priorities that you want to see from either major party?
Look, I think that for many people in our community right now, the economy is front and centre, and this is about cost of living, but this is also about the longer term indicators, the fact that we've had a housing crisis that has developed over 20 years but is really hurting people right now. We have a productivity crisis where it's really flatlining, and in industries like construction, it's dropped actually by 12% over the last 10 years. And so we have really anaemic economic growth, and I think people are really concerned about, do we have the right settings for the long term? And as well, we have this energy transition, we need to deal with that as well, but we need to be making better long-term decisions, and I think that's a real frustration from the community right now.
And those structural commitments are also so difficult to talk about when we have such a relatively frenetic election cycle, right? But I mean, if we take a look at tax, for example, in jurisdictions like the UK, it's a pretty healthy, robust debate. Why does it feel so much more toxic to be talking about that here? Look,
it's really disappointing, I'll be honest, to see how the major parties politically wedge each other on tax. And we went to the last election, for example, with both major parties saying, don't worry, we're not going to touch it. But we know when you talk to the economists, when you talk to the business community, and when you talk to actually people on the street who are struggling, particularly young people, to ever get a house in the first place, tax is a really critical issue. And so that's why, for instance, I've been put forward a tax green paper, because I'm so frustrated demonstrated that both the major parties have just effectively wedged each other so badly on tax that they're not willing to deal with some of the long-term challenges we face. And they're still, some of them are trying to run attack ads on me as well for actually having the courage to say, hey, tax is a serious issue. Let's put it on the table. We need a tax reform commission. We need to lower income taxes on people who are working because they can't get ahead. We need to make sure the tax system is backing innovation and investment because, we've got now 4% business investment in the non-mining sector compared to 9%. That's not going to work in the long term.
When it comes to property, is a negative gearing untouchable?
Look, I think that negative gearing and those tax settings have been overstated, but I think you can't ignore the tax system altogether when it comes to things like housing affordability. And it is a major issue. You see that now Sydney has the second most unaffordable housing in the world. You see that the young person sort of in their 30 to 34, they're now 20% less likely to be mortgage holders or owner-occupiers than a generation ago. So they are really, really falling behind. But I think that when you look at the tax system in relation to housing, I think stamp duty is one that is much stronger in terms of the case for reform, where if a reform to stamp duty, in New South Wales estimates has said that could increase home ownership by 300,000 people, by 6%. So I think there are options to look at the tax system in terms of the housing system, but it's more broadly. It's particularly about how do we help younger working people have the same quality of life that their parents have achieved.
Yeah, with baby boomer generations really heading into retirement, right? What are some of those tax reforms that you want to see in order to close that generational gap?
Look, what I think the biggest one that we really need to get on the front foot is how do you lower income taxes? Because that is the tax that everybody pays regardless of their background and regardless of where they've come from. And I met this young guy recently who said to me, he said, look, I've got everything I need. I've got a great job, so does my partner. I just don't have the bank of mum and dad. And that's really gutting for a country like Australia, which prides itself on the fair go that everyone can have an opportunity for housing. I actually spoke to a young group of finance executives who are working in the finance technology space in their late 20s, early 30s. And they all just felt, look, how home ownership, those opportunities are out of reach. And I spoke to a young woman the other day who said, we've got 2 kids. At this stage, we've got great jobs, but we can't afford to have a third one because of the challenges from an economic point of view and those young people getting ahead. So it is income tax that has to be front and centre in that piece, as well as I think some of those business investment taxes, because we really need to be driving innovation in our businesses because businesses drive wages, drive productivity, and that's what's really missing the economy right now.
So I know that we're still a ways off when it comes to election results, but as Ben was telling us earlier, it's most likely that we're going to see a minority government. Are there any key issues or points that you would need to see compromise on with the major parties in order to get your backing?
Well, look, we will see what happens, when the election happens and how the numbers fall. But I think the key, 3 priorities, I think, for my community are certainly that you see a smarter economy, one that is driving productivity, that is really driving innovation. Climate action, it's still really important. It doesn't go away just because we're having tougher economic times. We still need to make those investments in the long term, and also a kinder community, a kinder society. My community has been hit by a lot of the anti-Semitic attacks, but I also have a really big LGBTQ community, for example, who like the rest of the community thinks it's appalling that gay students and gay teachers can be expelled from school because of their sexuality, and then really concerned about issues like men's mental health and particularly young men. So there are different sort of range of priorities, but I think it's about that long-term evidence-based reform that the community is crying out for and which the major parties are really failing to deliver because of their political wedging.
I wanted to pick up on, obviously, the horrendous anti-Semitic attacks that we continue to see, particularly in our area. But what would you like to see from the major parties and what would you like to see from the government in terms of both balancing their position on Gaza and Palestine, but also adequately addressing, the hurt that we're seeing in those communities?
Look, I think we've got some legislation that's likely to come up next week in Parliament around incitement to violence, and I'm going to be proposing some amendments to really sort of deal with some of the vilification that can happen, not just of the Jewish community. It does happen of different communities. It happens certainly of the LGBTQ LGBTQ community as well. Because we know from the Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, he's repeatedly said, that words matter. And I think it's really critical that we do make sure that, sort of really extreme vilification that is really targeting parts of our community, that we stand out. And I think my community, across the community has been absolutely appalled by some of those attacks. And I think really want to see much more coming together and much less politicisation over wars overseas. Most Australians say to me, look, we have a range of different views on the war overseas, but we come to this country because everyone belongs. Everyone is welcome. What your faith, what your background, you are welcome here. And as a child of a migrant, I think those values are so important for us to protect right now.
Yeah, it's always startling to see multiculturalism take a hit in this way. And I do wonder, you mentioned that climate remains important, political integrity, one of the cores of how the Teals were elected in the last election. That felt like a watershed moment. Do you think some of that is going to be impacted negatively by economic policy?
Look, I think, for me, I've always said that a guy I met in Bondi actually told me, I asked him, what's important to you? And he gave me the best example, I think, of summating my community. And he said, look, I care about the environment. I live in a beautiful place. I want to pass it on to my kids. I want to live in a kind society. I want us to treat us decently. And I care about small business. I'm a small business owner, and that's really important to me. And I think we need to remind ourselves we can hold on to those three things. This isn't an either-or situation. We should be having political integrity. That actually allows us to have the big debates that we need to be having right now, rather than the smear campaigns and the wedging, which actually long-term hurts the economy. So the political integrity is critical. In terms of our energy transition, we're going to have a more expensive energy transition because we haven't faced the facts on climate earlier. And that is harder for business. So what I'm saying on climate is to say, this is about the economy as well as about the environment, because 90% of coal-fired power stations are going to close in the next 10 years. So we actually have to transition our economy anyway. Let's do it in the least cost way that we possibly can. So I think we've got to move away from that sort of dichotomy of saying, oh, you can't have values, for the long term and worry about the economy. We actually, if we think about all those things and hold those ideas together at once, then we can really actually look after the economy as well as the long-term prospects for our kids.